Hi, welcome to Navigating Health with Pacific Islander Communities, a learning course with Asian and Pacific Islander American Health Forum. My name is Alisi Tulua, and welcome to Module 4. This module is going to be talking about where we find ourselves as Pacific Islanders here in the United States. And it's called Home Now because we are settling here and are calling where we are home. I also just want to make sure that I pay my sacred acknowledgement to the indigenous people of the lands that all of our communities are on here in the United States. And that's just not here on the continent, but also we have large communities that are in Hawaii that are not Native Hawaiians. And I want to make sure that I acknowledge that we are settlers in these lands. And we hope that as we continue to navigate and grapple with that status, that we also are mindful about our contribution and our responsibility to the indigenous people of these lands. So this module will provide information about where Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders live in the United States and the health determinants that contribute to their lives. And so the objectives that I hope that we will achieve in this module is to develop knowledge about where Pacific Islander communities are in the United States, and also to increase understanding of the social determinants of health that are impacting Pacific Islanders today. I hope that you were able to remember and retain some of the information from Module 3, where I talked about some of the historical context with regards to our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities and their histories with regards to the United States and the kinds of relationships that exist that impact and determine the kind of benefits and accesses that our different communities have with this country. So I want to start by acknowledging also that all of the data that I will be talking about in this module is taken from this wonderful report called A Community of Contrast, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the United States. This report was published in 2014, and in large part, the data that is in this report is from the 2010 census. However, there are some data in this report that are from latter years up to 2014. And it is probably the best place to get data from our community. And this report was produced in collaboration with Empowering Pacific Islander Communities and Asian Americans Advancing Justice Los Angeles. And you can access this report, which provides data for our communities across the United States, including some key regions where we have large populations. And then there's also a similar report, but is focused on California. And you can find that on EPIC's website, www.empoweredpi.org. And this is a wonderful resource for anybody that's interested in data for the Pacific Islander community. So we'll start off with some demographics. There are, according to the most recent 2019 American Community Survey population estimate, states that there are 1.4 million Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders in the US currently, which makes up about 0.4% of the nation's total population, so a very small part of the population. There are more than 20 Pacific Islander ethnic groups living in the US, and many of them are captured here in data from the census. In fact, the US Census has probably the most comprehensive data on our different ethnic Pacific Island communities. And so as you can see here, the largest ethnic group under this population are our Native Hawaiian community. which numbers a little over 500,000 people. And that's counting folks that are in Hawaii and folks that are also living on the continent. Second to that is the Samoan community. Third is our Chamorro community, and then so on and so forth. So if you scan all the way down, you will see that there are some very small populations. Many of them belong under, if you remember from our previous module, many of them fall under what is called our COFA community, Compact to Free Association. And if you remember some of the relationships that we discussed in the previous module, I hope that you remember that with regards to some of these communities, as we're going to continue to share more about them. So according to the 2010 census, the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population grew 40% between 2000 and 2010. And so I'm really curious to see what the 2020 census will show in terms of the growth of our population. And that is, that makes the NHPI community one of the fastest growing communities in the US, behind the Asian American community and the Latino community. One really key point here that I want to make here is the data that I will be talking about. You can talk about population data in a few different ways. And the way that we talk about this data is, this is data that is reported as alone or in combination, which means that it captures anybody that indicates their race and ethnicity as one ethnic group, and in addition to that, anybody that reports their ethnicity mixed with anything else. And this is really important when it comes to our population, because the majority, more than 50% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders are multiracial. And so as you can see here, 56% of NHPIs are multiracial. And so it's important for us to be able to capture everybody that falls under the umbrella of NHPI, whether you are a single ethnic identity or you are mixed race with other racial groups. And so keep that in mind as we move through, because all the data that I will be talking about is data that is reported alone or in combination. This graph shows the population growth within our Pacific Islander ethnic groups. And although in this slide it says that our overall population grew 40%, when you look within our group and break it out into more granularity, you can see where the growth really comes from. And so I just took maybe, the top part of this and expand it out so you can look at it a little bit more closely. And when you take a look at this, the fastest growing groups within our Pacific Islander communities are mainly a lot of our smaller Micronesian populations. So as you can see here, the fastest growing grew by 544% is our Chuukese community. And then second to that is Solomon Islander. Solomon Islanders are Melanesian communities. Kosrae are communities that are from Kosrae, Marshallese, Carolinian, Pohnpeian, Mariana Islander, and Yapese round off the rest of our fastest growing group within our within our Pacific Islander populations. And so although in the previous slide it shows that these are our smaller community, these are our fastest growing communities. Where are our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders in the US? I think predictably you can see here, what I have here is I have the states listed in the order of largest, where we have our largest population. I have the top 10 states here. And then on the far right here is the what percent of the population is our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander community in those states. And so as you can see here, Hawaii has the largest NHPI population in the country. And second to that is California. and then Washington, Texas, Utah, Florida, Nevada, Oregon, New York, and Arizona. And I'll talk a little bit about, the migration pattern of our different communities. But this is listed in order in terms of like just raw population size. But when you look at the percent of the overall population in each of these states, you can see that the largest percent is in Hawaii. So about a little over a quarter of the population in Hawaii is Native Hawaiian and or Pacific Islander. And then the second one is Utah, where we have 1.6% of the state population is Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander. And then followed by Nevada. If that seems surprising to you, we have a large population of Native Hawaiians that have moved from Hawaii and have settled in Nevada. And then followed by Washington, we have a growing Kofa community in Washington. We also have a large Samoan community in Washington. And then the rest follows: California, Oregon at 0.8%. And then let's see here. And then, Arizona, and then followed by Texas and New York. Okay, so to give a little bit of context about those states. So one of the key reasons that Pacific Islanders migrated here to the U.S. are, fall mainly under these three reasons. Number one is military. A lot of our communities migrated here in alignment with the big world wars. And that is, many of our communities joined the military. It was made accessible for some of them, especially those that are in the territories. And so many of our folks that are from our Samoan community, our Chamorro community from Guam and the Mariana Islands, are in the military and migrated here due to their participation in the military. The other reason for migration is economic opportunity. So either that is people were seeking jobs and it was easier to come here to find jobs, or people were seeking educational advancement. And so those are two different ways that people were seeking economic opportunities. And many of those reasons is to, number one, help to find ways for the family themselves to progress economically, but also as a way to help support the economies back in the islands and the families back there. There were more opportunities for getting jobs and getting work here in the U.S. Third, and absolutely not least, is many migrated to the U.S. seeking health care because of lack of infrastructure and capacity in the islands for growing health issues such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer. And so many families migrate to the U.S. seeking health care. And so that's usually the reason for initial migrations, but you can see then where many of our communities have settled correspond to those reasons for migration. And so you will definitely find a lot of our populations, especially around military bases. You will find large Samoan and Chamorro communities around military bases. And of course, once a family or two has migrated to those areas, then what tends to happen is many other families will follow and settle there, whether or not they're part of the military, but it's because they have existing families in those areas. Many folks would move there. A lot of people have settled around jobs where they can find jobs. So you will see this, I'll use it as an example of the Tongan community. You'll find a lot of people work in the large airports. And so where you have airline hubs, you will see large Tongan communities. And so you see that around LAX, around San Francisco. We have large community in Seattle, in Denver, because people are following many of their airline jobs, and then their families end up settling there. Another prominent employer of Pacific Islanders is caregiving. And so you'll find large populations of Pacific Islanders, particularly Samoan, Tongan, Fijians around areas where there's a lot of caregiving jobs. So places where you have a lot of elderly, more affluent communities, you will see also Pacific Island communities there. And then last but not least, for the many of the communities, let me just rewind. One of the other key job areas where you have a lot of settlement is also in the Midwest, particularly Arkansas, where you have the largest Marshallese community in the US is in Arkansas. And that's because folks have found employment with meatpacking companies. And so many of the COFA communities have settled around the Midwest because of a lot of the meat companies there where they have been able to find employment. So that's another key area of jobs where many of our communities have settled. And then lastly, those that come seeking healthcare tend to settle in areas where they will have access to healthcare. So you see this with many of our communities in Hawaii. For a time, the state of Hawaii was covering healthcare costs for that was not covered by the federal government. And so we have parts of our community who came here primarily to seek healthcare would settle in states that provided that kind of access to them. Okay, now I'm going to go into the social determinants of health that help to contribute to the health outcomes in Pacific Islander communities. And many of you that are watching this are already familiar with what social determinants of health are, but just to give you a definition, these are the conditions in the environment where people live, work, play, and worship that affect a wide range of health and quality of life outcomes and risks. And so, these are all of the things that are surrounding people's lives that help to contribute to their well-being and their health. And if you think back to the first couple of modules where I talk about this framework that around land, this framework of health around land and a holistic view of health for Pacific Islander community that aligns really well with our cultural values. Thinking about social determinants of health also makes sense that your health doesn't exist within the individual body, but everything else that is surrounding you also impacts your health. And so what I'm going to touch on is some data around that illustrate economic stability, education access and quality, healthcare access and quality, neighborhood and built environment, and social and community context. So firstly is some data around economic stability. So according many of these definitions I am taking from Healthy People 2030. And so according to Healthy People 2030, under economic stability, in the United States, many people can't afford things like healthy foods, healthcare, and housing. And these things contribute in large part to whether a family is able to access or have a healthy life and whether they can provide that for their families also. And so one's economic stability contributes to one's health. And then when you think at the community level, right, the economic stability of a community contributes also to that community's health. And so this is one key data point that I pulled, and this is just looking at poverty and low income. So when you're looking at this graph, the top bar indicates the percent of that population that is low income. And then the bottom bar indicates the percent of that population that is considered living in poverty. And so as you can see here, if we're looking at the total population of the US, so 32% are low income, 14% are living in poverty. If you were looking at the overall NHPI, you can see here that a larger percent of NHPIs are considered low income, and also a larger percent of NHPIs altogether are considered living in poverty. But when you look at the data, when it is disaggregated even more into our ethnic groups, you can see here that our Marshallese community have, our 73% are considered low income, 49% are considered living in poverty. And then you can see here, second to that is the Tongan community. And then after that is the Samoan community. So these three Pacific Island communities have higher rates of low income and poverty than the aggregated NHPI, and also higher than the total population. And then the number of Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders who were living in poverty increased 56% between 2007 and 2011. And this is a growth rate that is higher than any other racial group. I believe, this is the time of the recession. Many people lost jobs. There were a lot of things going on at this time. And so for a community to suffer this kind of loss can have a huge impact on, if you imagine, mental health that also contributes to physical health within families. All right, let's see. One of the key things that I also wanted to highlight in this is that, there's another data point that I didn't get a chance to put up here, but it is not for the lack of people wanting to work. Some of the other data captures the fact that let's see, many in Pacific Islander communities have 2 to 3 income earners per household, and typically in the Pacific Islander community there are multi-family, multi-generations that live within one household. And so you imagine, even if you do have a lot of other people that are working, it is supporting a larger household. And also at the same time, although people are working 2 or 3 jobs, many of them are working in low-paying, low-wage jobs. And so it's a challenge. So this is where the community is with regards to economic stability. Second to this is education access and quality. So data has shown that people with higher levels of education are more likely to be healthier and live longer. And so the information that I have here is a bachelor degree attainment for the population that's 25 years or older. When you look at the total population, you will see here that 28% of the total population that are 25 years or older have a bachelor degree or higher. That is compared to the Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander aggregated percent of 18%. And so if we look above that, you can see here the communities that have lower bachelor degree attainment in this age group and older. You can see the Palauan community, Tongan community, Fijian, Samoan, and Marshallese. And so you imagine these communities that have lower than average bachelor degree attainment. You can assume that with a lower level of education also means, lower paying jobs and resulting in poor health. So among regions with significant proportions of NHPIs, high school graduation rates among that population are lower than average, and dropout rates are higher than average. And so you can see this even lower than just the bachelor, than the college level education outcomes. You see already some of this happening with high school, so lower level education. And so even just to reach college level attainment is a challenge for many of the communities. All right. The next area is healthcare access and quality. The data that is pulled in to illustrate this is the percent of our community that are uninsured. And people without insurance are less likely to have a primary care provider, and they may not be able to find affordable, they may not be able to afford the healthcare services and medications that they need. And so you imagine a population that is more at risk for poor health outcomes to also, on top of that, not even have health coverage for them and their families, makes it even worse. And so if we take a look at the total population, about 15% of the total population is uninsured. And then even lower than that, actually the NHPI aggregated data of 14% don't have insurance, which is lower than the total population. However, when that is broken out, you can see the Native Hawaiian community have the lowest uninsured rate at 10%. But when you look at some of the other communities, so let's look up here, more than a quarter of the Tongan community don't have insurance. The Marshallese community is not that far behind that. A Fijian community and the Chamorro community have high rates of higher than the total population rates of uninsurance. And so this talking point just illustrates that. So among NHPI ethnic groups, over 1 in 4 Tongan Americans do not have health insurance. Tongan, Marshallese, Fijian, and Guamanian or Chamorro Americans are less likely to be insured than average. Next is looking at neighborhood and built environment. And so if I could just read this, and I'll talk, the piece of data that I built in to talk about this is home ownership versus renters. And, as an indicator of the kinds of homes that Pacific Islanders live in, I think this data point is really important. So just to read this, many people in the US live in neighborhoods with high rates of violence, unsafe air or water, and other health and safety risks. Racial, ethnic minorities, and people with low incomes are more likely to live in places with these risks. In addition, some people are exposed to things at work that can harm their health, like secondhand smoke or loud noises. So many of our communities live in low income, high, very dense environment. And so you can see here, so if we're looking at the total population, so let's see. So on the right here are the, oh my gosh, I can't even really see that. On the right here is the rate of renters, and then on the left is home ownership. And so as you can see here in this yellow bar, the total population, you can see here, if we just extrapolate this line all the way up to the top here, you can see that so many of our Pacific Islander communities fall above here, which means that the only population that falls below the total population here is a white community. Everybody else falls above that, which means that there are higher rates of people that are renting and lower rates of people that are homeowners. And when you're thinking about folks that are renting, of course, people are renting single dwelling homes, but many of the people that are renting apartments. And then when you're thinking about places that have, exposure to secondhand smoke and loud noises, many of those places, children don't have access to green space to play and exercise. And so when you're looking at, some of our communities here, our Chuukese communities, 91% renters and 9% homeowners. And so this is a really stark comparison of just the state of like where our communities might be living and the kinds of environmental factors they might be exposed to. Last but not least is social and community context. And that is, this is just looking at like how connected the community is to the social interactions within the neighborhoods that they live in, and their investment and feeling of ownership and what's going on in those communities. And that makes a difference in terms of people's health. So many people face challenges and dangers they can't control, like unsafe neighborhoods, discrimination, or trouble affording things that they need. This can have a negative impact on health and safety throughout life. And so the two pieces of data that I pulled in here, and mind you, there is not a lot of good data. This is probably most of the data that I could pull in. So we're lacking a lot of data that can speak to a lot of these factors. But what I pulled in here is the percent of registered voters as an indicator of how involved the community is, our population is in overall community. And then the other piece of data is the growth in number of those that are incarcerated. And so you can see here that the rate of those that are registered to vote, when you're looking at the NHPI number, it is lower than average, which is 71%, and only 58% of Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander eligible people are registered to vote, which is very low. And then looking at incarceration, and you can see maybe this is an indicator of how safe the community is, and maybe even discrimination and racism that folks might face. You can see here is a really stark comparison here in California, where you have a 2% growth in the total population in those that are incarcerated, and then you compare it to this blue bar indicates the growth in NHPI population, NHPI folks that were incarcerated, and that grew by 144%. And this is looking at data between 2002 and 2010. And so, that is a really huge difference. And you imagine that kind of loss in the community, that kind of disconnection in families can contribute to a lot of health outcomes that are negative, not just within that family, but within the larger community that are also connected to those families. Let's see. And I'm just showing here some of the other states. Here is also Utah. You can see there's a huge difference also. And then in Hawaii, there was actually a decline in the number of those that are into the total population that were incarcerated. And then you see a growth in the NHPI population that were incarcerated. So these, at least we have data for some of these key states where we have large populations. Let's see. I think that that might be the last piece of the 5 different social determinants of health that I wanted to talk about. But, just to wrap up all of that, I hope that gives you an understanding of, of course, we're aware of how social determinants of health contribute to the health of individuals and community. But when you consider the ways that there is lack of access based on the information I shared in Module 3, and just lack of awareness because of lack of capacity within community organizations in the community to be able to help families, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander families, all of those things brought together really contribute to huge disparities in health for the Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander communities. And so I hope that at this point, we're at the end of Module 4, you've been able to build context from Module 1 and 2 and 3 and arrive at this point where you have a bigger and more complete picture of how of how these disparities exist in our community and are built into so many different pieces that make up and contribute to who we are as Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So we have 2 more modules left, and I hope to be able to continue to give you some more information, but we're going to go into our knowledge check. Number 1, most of the NHPI data reported for race and ethnicity shared here are measured for what data categories? A, alone, B, multiracial, C, alone or in any combination, or D, none of the above. You have an answer? C. Most of the data that I shared here today is reported as alone or in any combination. Number 2, which of these was not a reason for the migration of Pacific Islanders to the US? A, economic opportunity, and this is based on what I shared. B, war refugees, C, healthcare access, or D, military. The answer is war refugees. All right, one more. Which of these is indicated as a social determinant of health in this presentation? A, economic stability, B, military enlistment, C, climate justice, or D, life expectation. The answer is A, economic stability. All right, well, we're at the end of Module 4. I hope that you were able to learn something new and we were able to meet the objectives set out at the beginning of this presentation. And of course, as always, I would like to leave you with a quote from one of our prominent leaders. And today I'm sharing a quote from Teresa Siamatonu, who is a poet, activist, educator, organizer, everything. Great, brilliant young leader, and a prominent spoken word artist. You can find a lot of her work on YouTube. Check it out. This is from her poem called Rise Up. Education is like healing the wounded. Some of us need an education just so we can heal. Because if I learned anything about being a student, it's that school never taught me how to think critically. It taught me what to think critically about. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.